Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Earlier in the week, I did an episode talking about the post-spawn funk. And one of the techniques that I talked about that you could use to get through that post-spawn funk was fishing bluegill beds. Fishing bluegill beds can be real productive and it can pull in some really big fish, but there are certain baits that are really more productive than others when it comes to fishing around those bluegill beds. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what those baits are and how to work them, what to look for when you are fishing bluegill beds. Stick around, guys. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher, and today we're talking about fishing around bluegill beds. Like I indicated in the episode before, fishing bluegill beds right after the spawn, there's a specific time of year that you can do this, and it works great, and you can catch some big fish doing it. One of the things before we get into the baits is talking about why this is so effective. Again, I mentioned before, the bass have finished spawning. They aren't moving, they may be moving deep, but they're gonna take that detour and hang out around those bluegill beds. They're resting, but they're also looking to feed up. And bedding spawning bluegill is a real easy meal for the bass to take advantage of. You're not gonna see them just hanging out in the middle of those beds. What they're going to do typically is find a place to set up, whether it be a weed line, whether it be stumps, whether it be a lay down, something along those lines, and they're gonna hang out and kind of rest or ambush from that position. And then what I've noticed is you will see these bass kind of cruising, almost kind of like I've seen in my area. There are times when we'll see coyotes or predators kind of just stalking around the farms, kind of just keeping an eye on those chickens in the chicken coop, kind of not really doing anything, but circling and just and that's what these bass do, is they'll kind of every once in a while, they'll just roam around where these bluegill beds are. And they're just kind of keeping their eye open for a stray bluegill or bluegill that's dying or something like that. And so keeping that in mind, what you're looking to do is to imitate a bluegill that is in distress or that isn't actively on a bed. Before we talk about the baits to use around bluegill beds, guys, if you wouldn't mind, hit that subscribe button, that notification button. We're putting out content Monday through Friday, every weekday, with the idea of we're trying to share our content to help you catch more fish, and that's our goal here. We'd love for you to be a part of the channel and check in with us every day on Mark Fisher Outdoors. So let's talk about the baits that I use when I'm fishing around bluegill beds. One of the first baits that I go to is a little popper, and obviously I'm going to use one that is a bluegill colored type of imitation. And there's two reasons for this. One is it imitates a bluegill that's in distress up on the surface, but it's also a popper is not a bait that you move out of the strike zone. You can work that bait in a specific area and twitch it and pop it, and it creates a disturbance, but it's not gonna move out of that area quickly. You can keep it there, you can let it sit, you can pop it a little bit and let it sit. So it's gonna stay in that area for a longer period of time. If you have a bass cruising a bluegill bed and you make a disturbance up on the top, it may take a while for that bass to locate that disturbance and get over to it to be able to decide to strike it. And so you wanna keep that bait in that strike zone, in that area, for as long as you can. The second bait that I would use And this one isn't necessarily, in my opinion, imitating a bluegill, is just a wacky rig Senko. I think working a Senko, and again, to be honest, whether it's wacky rigged or even a weightless Texas rigged Senko, but it's a bait that has a slow fall. And again, this is a bait that I may use if the bluegill beds are in a little deeper water. I'm gonna use that Senko and I'm gonna use it weightless, where that bait slowly falls down to the bottom. Again, if I've got a cruising bass, I want that bass to be able to see that bait falling down to the bottom. Remember, on a bait like that, don't work it too fast. Actually, don't give it, just let it flutter down and let it sink on the bottom and stay on the bottom. A lot of times, you're actually gonna get that bait. That bait is gonna attract the fish as it's falling, but they aren't going to actually eat the bait until it lands on the bottom or until you give it a little twitch or pop where it comes off the bottom. So second bait is a wacky rig Senko or a Texas rigged weightless Senko. My next bait is going back to imitating a bluegill, and it's a swim jig. I love throwing the core tackle swim jig in the guilty pleasure. I think core tackle has made a color here with what they call guilty pleasure that is just a great bluegill colored imitating bait. And I love throwing swim jigs, and a swim jig is a bait that I can work through the bluegill bed. I can work it around pieces of cover that I think those bass are holding on, like stumps and logs, over grass, weeds that they're hanging out into and things like that. And so a swim jig is the third type of bait that I will throw around bluegill beds. And then finally is a bait that we just recently talked about in our underwater episode, which I'm really keen on, and that is this new bellows gill. We talked about this in our Underwater Wednesday episode. This little bait absolutely imitates a bluegill, and this is a place that I would throw this either weightless, Texas rigged, or possibly, as we saw on Wednesday, on a drop shot, maybe even on a shaky head. So I think this one, I have yet to throw this on bluegill beds, but this is definitely a bait that I'm going to put in my arsenal when it comes to fishing bluegill beds. Guys, we talked about this before. Fishing bluegill beds is a strategy to use when the fish are in that post-spawn funk, and these are definitely baits that I would suggest you giving a shot. When you see those honeycomb bluegill beds around, work the outside of those edges where those bass are kind of patrolling around and cruising around, and see if you don't come away with a few nice big bass that are feeding up on those bluegill on those beds. Guys, we appreciate you tuning in. We got another episode coming out tomorrow. Take care, everybody.